On this episode of Locked On Lightning, we continue our player previews. By today, we're talking about Victor Hedman.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. Today's episode of Locked On Lightning is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/Locked On to get started. As I said before, we are talking about Victor Hedman, continuing our player previews leading up to the season starting on October 10th, only 14 days away from opening night against the Nashville Predators. And we got a lot of previews coming up, so you definitely don't want to miss out on those. So subscribe to the podcast wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We are also available on YouTube. So Victor Hedman is, I think we could all agree, going to be a very important piece to the puzzle that is the Tampa Bay Lightning getting back to the Stanley Cup final, because let's face it, the making the playoffs at this point in time for the Lightning isn't enough. I think that still the mantra, given the setback last year, the first round elimination to Toronto, is still Stanley Cup or bust for this team. And as we have seen in years past, especially the 2 Stanley Cup wins, Victor Hedman was a huge part of that success that the Lightning had, winning the Smythe Trophy in the bubble in 2020. And the last couple of years with Hedman, and depending on whether or not you want to count 2021 in terms of statistics, because let's face it, for the most part, season statistics, I feel like for the most part, you can't really judge a player for that season, especially if it's a season where, the numbers are skewed because of the lack there of numbers. He only played 54 out of the 56 potential games that season, and his stats are somewhat similar to that from last year in terms of goals and points and all that. But and then after that, I mean, pick as you may, we look at him in 21-22 full season, which is phenomenal. I think I've said that for mostly every Lightning player, and will say that for mostly every Lightning player, that the key is, just get these guys through 82 games with minimal injury, wear and tear, and these guys will put up the stats. In 21-22, just to recap, he throws up probably the best offensive season of his career, 20 goals, 85 points. And then I guess that's why we look at last season to a certain degree and say that was an off year for him. He only has 9 goals and puts up 49 points. And that's also in 76 games played. So he did miss 6 games last year. And I don't think really, when we look at Victor Hedman's 22-23 season, I don't think we should look at the stats and say he had an off year. I think if you watched enough of this team, as I would imagine a lot of Lightning fans who are listening to this or watching us have, I think we could agree that the stats weren't that big of a deal. I think what the big deal for us was that he didn't look like himself defensively. We didn't exactly see the Victor Hedman that won a Norris Trophy in 17-18, that has really finished in the top 3 in the Norris Trophy category really over the last 5 years. I mean, he did finish in 15th, but I mean, I don't know how much stock you want to take in that. But when you look at his season and you see how he played defensively, that level of play that we normally expect from him, that was really something that I think really hurt the Lightning to a certain extent. I think it's something that when they needed somebody to clamp down, or the one thing that they really is really that their Achilles heel is turnovers in the neutral zone. They didn't really have that guy that could chase down the puck handler going down the other side of the ice. They didn't really have that. And Victor Hedman is normally that person. I think we could all agree it's, he's not the fastest skater or the fastest defenseman really in the league. I think what really sets him apart is really his instincts, his ability to take the right angle down the ice just to cut off guys. And we didn't see that. Some might say it was injury, and we did find out that he was playing banged up for a majority of the season. But what I said during the course of the season, if you were listening to the podcast then, was that, clearly there's something off with this guy. And if that's the case, you got to rest him now because it's not going to get any better. and I felt like the Lightning at that point in time, even though they weren't playing up to the standards that we all expected them to, I think that they were going to be able to hang in it for at least a couple of weeks until he kind of gets sorted out, if it even were able to just be a couple of weeks. Because let's face it, I mean, he not only looked injured, and I saw some tweets during the year where people were saying he looks old and worn down, and yes, we could also attribute the multiple cup runs in 3 years to that. But like I stated before, I mean, when you look at him as opposed to other players on this team, his production was drastically down, and it was mainly on the defensive side, and mainly because he just didn't look like his normal self. I don't think it was chalked up to fatigue. I just think mentally he was worn down, and that's really something where, like I said, if the Lightning at that point in time, if they were able to kind of give him some rest, or maybe give him that week off, or maybe less ice time that week off before the All-Star break, maybe that would have changed things, but at the same time, maybe it wouldn't. I mean, hockey is a totally different sport. It's not exactly like basketball where we could just sit here and see guys taking nights off. It's also not the mentality in the NHL for guys to take nights off. And I guarantee if John Cooper were to throw that idea or even attempt to do so with Victor Hedman, it probably wouldn't have been a good situation, not only with Hedman, but also with other guys on this team. So really, if we have to sum up Victor Hedman's 2022-23 season, really what we can say with him is that it was a huge disappointment. And I'm not blaming him for that first round exit at whatsoever. I'm not blaming him for really the Lightning looking mediocre throughout the course of the season. But I can't sit here and not tell you that it wasn't a contributing factor. So take that as you will. Let me know in the comments below what you think. I think with Victor Hedman, I think that, even though he's going into his age 32, 33 season, his birthday is in December, so he'll be 33 then, midway through the season. I still think there's a lot of hockey to be played. I still think that he could be the minutes eater that we know that he is. I still think that he could be the defensive lockdown defenseman that we have come to appreciate throughout his time in Tampa Bay. I think that he could do all those things. It's just a matter of, is his body in the right condition to do so? We will have to see. But then again, what I've stated was when the Lightning did lose in the first round at Toronto was that even though it sucks that this is the shortest playoff run the Lightning have had in quite some time, I still think that was the most beneficial thing towards this team going forward. And to a guy like Victor Hedman, I think that really was something that will benefit him at least going into this season. So let me know in the comments below what you think about that. Let me know. Do you disagree with my take? Because like I said, I appreciate the back and forth that we have, especially on YouTube. If you want to DM me on X, formerly known as Twitter, you can hit me up at dankydank, DENKYD8NK, with your questions, with your comments, and I will most certainly talk about it on the next show or the next episode. So be sure to do that. So before we talk about our predictions, how we feel about him in general going forward, was last year a fluke as well? Because we can look at it that way. We'll talk about that as well coming up on the next segment. But first, I want to talk about our friends over at FanDuel Sportsbook. Now, listen, if you're not using FanDuel Sportsbook and you're betting on the NFL or upcoming NHL season or Major League Baseball playoffs, I got to ask you, what are you doing? Because if you're not betting with America's number one sports book, then you're not doing it right. Because right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel Sportsbook, there's no better time to get in on the action with their amazing spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Visit FanDuel.com and include money lines, props, all of that. Everything is included in there. You could get it all in one place, and that's FanDuel Sportsbook. So, as always, I like to thank everybody for making us your first listen of the day. And if you haven't already done so, please go ahead, like and subscribe to the podcast. We are available wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We are also available on Sirius XM, so you could stream us from there as well. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Like I've stated on past episodes, we'll be running a raffle as soon as we hit 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. And if you are subscribed to the podcast, you'll be automatically entered into the raffle for a special prize. Like I said, we are talking about Victor Hedman. Was last year a fluke? Expectations for the big man in the 2023-24 season. And I guess, was last year a fluke? I think that is a good question to really try and answer, or at least ask at this point in time. Like I said, at the top of the show, and just to recap, in 21-22, 20 goals, 85 points, his best offensive season ever, all career highs. And then with 6 less games, only 9 goals and 49 points. If you watched all the games last year, really, he looked hurt. He looked old. And, I'm not bashing on him. It's just, if you watch the games, I'm sure if you were to ask him whether it be in front of a mic or behind closed doors, I think to a certain degree he would agree with that, regardless if injury was truly a factor, which it was. But I think that he could agree, as well as all Lightning fans can agree, that he needs to be better in order for this team to be successful. And so, was last year a fluke? And my answer to that will be only if this year is an improvement. And that might be the easy way out. But when you look at him at this point in his career and what he's accomplished thus far, and let me preface this by saying I don't care about the stats. I really don't. If you've been a listener of this show for quite some time, there's more that I evaluate to players on this team other than stats. I think that the only players that really warrant, criticism of certain stats are the offensive guys, the big time goal scorers and maybe the goalies to a certain extent. I think that with defensemen, it's really not fair, especially if you're not a Cal McCarr. It's really unfair to evaluate defensemen by just purely offensive numbers. Um, I mean, really, when you look at it, plus minus, there's a lot of things that come into really a lot of variables that you have to take into account in order to evaluate that number. Because a guy could have a terrible plus minus, be a very good player, and play on a terrible team, whereas Victor Hedman plays on one of the better teams in the NHL, and his plus minus was only in the 10, whereas in previous years it's been 20s, 30s. So you can't really look at that. And he didn't exactly have a individual good career, good year last year. So that's also that you got to take into account. And but what I will say with defensemen, what you really have to do is you have to give them the eye test. And the only way to do that's why if you watch the national broadcast of NHL coverage, whether it be on NHL Network or TNT or whatever the case may be, at least I wouldn't take too much stock in terms of how some of these guys or analysts evaluate players, just because they're not watching these players on a nightly basis. They may be watching certain highlights of these guys that surface on the internet or through NHL.com or wherever the case may be, but they're not watching shift by shift. And I think that's the only way you could look at Victor Hedman throughout the course of this season, and then look back at last season and determine whether or not it's a fluke. He's also, like I stated before, he's turning 33 in December, so you got to take that into account. He's played a ton of minutes in his career. For the most part, he's averaged close to 23 minutes of ice time consistently on a yearly basis per night. He's been playing since he was 19 years old, and he's been playing at a very high level since he was 19 years old. And we also have to take that into account too. As I've stated for other players, when I was talking about Alex Killorn in the offseason and whether or not the Lightning were going to bring him back, and not only bring him back, give him X amount of money, and if he was worth it. You also got to take that into account with Victor Hedman. He's got a lot of miles on him, depending on whether or not we see an improvement this year in his age 33 season. Has yet to be determined. Will that have an effect? Usually defensemen from that era, from his era, where, you still played a very physical defenseman, it wasn't really offensive oriented like we see nowadays with this new generation of defensemen. These defensemen, especially guys like Victor Hedman, have a lot of wear and tear, especially going into his 15th season in the NHL. He can't run at full speed or at the speed that we're accustomed to every year. It's just physically impossible. But I still think, having said that, we will see more of the same in terms of the positive things from him. I think that even though he may lose a step, whether it be this year or next year or over the next couple of years, I still think he's a very smart player. The way he played in the Stanley Cup playoffs over the last couple of years, especially the year he won the Conn Smythe, has proven that. That style of play was a big reason as to why the Lightning were as successful. The one thing I want to see from him, even though I just got done saying stats don't matter, is that I really think that we need to see more aggression from him on the offensive side of things. And this is something that I think more so goes back to John Cooper wanting the guys to play a certain way, and just for some reason just tends to get away from. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, when the Lightning made those two big runs to the Stanley Cup Finals and won back-to-back years, the reason why they did was because Victor Hedman did a phenomenal job of scoring. And we saw that during the 21-22 season, more of that scoring. His ability not only to score goals and distribute the puck efficiently, but his aggression. And what I mean by that, taking the puck into the high slot, kind of almost daring the defense or the opposing team really to step up to him, which leaves open space for other players on the ice. And we didn't really see a whole ton of that this year. What we saw from him for the most part on the offensive side of things was really timid, conservative. And when you play conservative hockey, more times than not, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to turn over the puck. And I'm not saying that Victor Hedman needs to go out there and score 20 goals, tally almost 90 points. No, I just want to see a different style offensively from him. I want to see more of what we expect from him, what he has proven that he can do. I think that, contrary to belief, I think this team is a lot better now than it was a year ago going into the season. I think that they have a good offensive core. I think they have a good defensive core. I think we have players around on this team that are really, if they weren't a year ago, they have grown up now and are able to kind of support him on the ice. And him playing alongside Nick Perbix. Now, we'll talk about Nick Perbix, obviously, when we do his preview, but I think that we have a better group of players, whether through changes or just through growth, where he could kind of go back to that style to where if mistakes are made, other guys could rise to the occasion and help out and be better supporting players. And I don't see why not John Cooper shouldn't allow Victor Hedman to kind of go back to that style. You know, it might very well be the reason why he wasn't playing like that a year ago was really because he was hurt. He was banged up, and that's understandable. But really now there's no excuse. I really expect him to kind of do more of the same in 21-22. He may not be quick on his feet like maybe what we've seen from him in the past, but like I said, he's one of the smarter players on the ice. He knows where to be at what points in time. And on the offensive side of things, I think that especially with all the weapons that the Lightning do have at their disposal, I would expect Victor Hedman to pretty much show everybody, not only in the Lightning fan base, but in the NHL fan base, that last year was indeed a fluke. So wrapping things up on the show, like I said, if you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. That means Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Sirius XM streaming. We're available on there as well. And go ahead and subscribe to the podcast on our YouTube page. We're continuing to grow. And follow us on our social media pages. LO_Lightning on Twitter, as well as LockedOn_Lightning on Instagram. You can follow me on Twitter or X or whatever you like to call it at DankyDank, DENKYD8NK. Love hearing from all of you. I've gotten some questions over the last couple of days. If you want to reach out, like I said, if you want to reach out to me there, that's fine. If you want to comment under the video, this one or whatever video, that's fine as well. As soon as I see it, I will answer it on the following episode. But yeah, very interesting season coming up for Victor Hedman. And that goes for a lot of the core players that are kind of aging or kind of on the older side of their careers. The Steven Stamkoses, the Victor Hedmans, you know, those guys who have been around for pretty much the entirety of this team, going from little middle of the pack to being Stanley Cup contenders on a yearly basis. And I would expect Victor Hedman to really just get it back together, to really just show us more of that top 3 Norris Trophy defenseman. Like I said, I really don't care about the goals. I really don't care about the points. All I care about is the defensive side of things. If he goes out there and puts up 9 goals and 40 points again, as long as he's playing solid on the defensive side of the ice and playing a 200-foot game, I really don't care. The Lightning have enough weapons that to where they don't have to rely on 77 to go out there and score goals and score points, but they're definitely going to need him to at least be the quarterback on the power plays this year and to really be reliable in that sense. And I expect him to, especially with a full summer to kind of get back to square one and to be able to really get back to the basics and work on that and get his body right. So we will be continuing our player previews up until opening night. So you definitely want to look on out for that. So hit that notification button wherever we are available. So as soon as the newest episode drops, you will be notified of the new clip. So in the meantime, that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I'll talk to you on the next one.